Welcome everybody to Irrational Labs Friday membership event. Today you are in for a treat. You're going to learn all about the psychology of risk with Lisa Zaval. She's a behavioral scientist and research consultant with broad expertise in behavioral economics, consumer behavior, and social psychology. She holds a PhD in judgment decision-making psychology from Columbia University and completed a postdoc training at the Center for Decision Sciences at the Columbia Business School. Lisa's work has been published in an array of prestigious academic journals, including these little journals. These are all massive journals: Psychological Science, PNAS, Nature, Climate Change, and she's also appeared in numerous media outlets such as the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and Scientific American. In addition to Lisa's academic research and experience, she has over 5 years of applied behavioral science consulting experience working across a range of industries. She does healthcare, she does financial services, she does energy efficiency, market research, everything. She does it all to apply her professional knowledge of behavioral science to solve practical business and policy challenges. She has worked with Facebook, CUNA Mutual, Ipsos, PG&E, and the United Nations, and many other organizations. She's a wonderful human being. Despite all this, she's great fun to work with. She's very smart, incredibly thoughtful, and always loaded with insights. You're going to get a ton of them today. What I just needed to let you know, though, is she also holds an adjunct research science appointment at Columbia University, and she's taught judgment and decision-making courses and research methods. So, Lisa, before you start, I just want you to quickly tell us worst decision you ever made.
Oh, no.
I'm kidding. I just thought it was a great setup though, because
I love it. I'll tell you what. I'll tell you what's on my mind right now is I'm considering an addition on my house.
Okay.
And the type of thinking about probabilities and risk reward, it's just all in my head, and I really am feeling quite loss averse and preventative focus. So that's what's on my mind right now. But Ryan, I love that you led with that, because what I'm really excited about for this particular presentation is hopefully we can think about insights that apply to your work, to your customers' challenges, to your users' challenges, right? Thinking about situations in which your user might be facing some sort of risk, and how might you apply learnings from today to drive towards your key behavior. But I'm really hoping that a lot of the insights we'll be talking about today are going to be really relevant to your own life, right? Help you better understand how you make decisions, especially under situations of risk or uncertainty. And I would, as Ryan mentioned, I'm a teacher. I'd love for this presentation to be interactive. I have a lot of slides prepared, but I can stop at any point if we want to get into discussion. I love that I see so many people with their cameras on. I feel like I'm not used to that. So I have a hunch you guys are going to be participatory. So even better than writing in the chat, which is also great, I can see it. You can also just jump off mute and provide a comment if anything feels very relevant to your work or your life. I always love hearing about new examples to help illustrate and apply these concepts. So just to give you an overview of the topics I'm going to be trying to go over today, I'm going to start by talking about how people cognitively process risk information. And then I'm going to highlight some of the cognitive biases most relevant to risky decision-making, with a deep dive into availability bias, and closing with a discussion of the types of risks that people tend to over or under protect against, and why. So this presentation it tends to be a bit academic, but we can try to focus more on product examples or communication design if that's of greater interest to this group. But it's going to start a bit theoretical, a bit academic. So we'll start simple. What is risk perception? For psychologists, it refers to really the subjective types of judgments and thoughts that people have about different characteristics or the severity of a risk of facing a negative outcome. And to understand the psychology of risk perception, it really helps just to take a step back and to just consider how people process risk or make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So it's important to understand, how do we process cognitive information in general, right? We all know we make thousands of decisions every day. Some are more conscious, some are unconscious, some are very analytical, like taking an assessment. Some are more automatic and reflective, like parallel parking and quickly trying to judge which object might be closer to you, right? Some decisions and choices are driven by our gut, our emotion, and some aren't. And the field of psychology has long theorized this distinction between this sort of emotional and a rational information processing, which basically suggests that people have two different systems of receiving and processing information. So one, known as system 2, is a very conscious, explicit, more analytic system, right, where reason tends to dominate. And the other is referred to as system 1. This is our unconscious emotional system, which is more automatic, and it's more based on our gut, our intuitive reactions. Now, both are really critical to our decision-making ability, right? Some people look and they say, well, system 2 is highly valued, right? We should always try to make decisions in system 2 that are purely rational and analytical. But people often forget feeling and your gut instinct is a form of thinking, right? Both systems are legitimate ways that humans can process information, but feeling is faster, right? When we go with our gut. And system 1's fast thinking is often useful. Sometimes, I mean, there are many times when we need to make these really quick, automatic, or intuitive and fast judgments. And in these situations, when we need to make these sort of associative judgments about a situation, our brain needs to rely on what are known as decisional shortcuts or mental heuristics or biases, which can sometimes lead us astray. Sometimes they're helpful, sometimes this can lead us astray, right? And sometimes this leads to biased judgments or misperceptions about risk. Now, when we're processing risky information, our assessments of risk could be run through system 1 or through system 2. But we do tend to rely more on system 1 when time for judgment is a bit more limited. And we also tend to rely more on system 1 that when the decision we're making feels more emotional or more vivid or more salient. So just to summarize, remember that we don't assess risks objectively, right? Our perception depends on more than objective measures of danger, statistics, information, careful analysis. Instead, our risk perceptions are really influenced by our emotions, which can lead to sometimes inaccurate judgments about risk or cognitive biases. So there are a number of different cognitive biases or psychologies that we've all experienced where emotion tends to impact our perception of risk. I'm going to just cover 3 to 4 of these today that influence our risk perception. And I'm going to start by talking about, I think, the most common bias that impacts risk perception that I know everybody on this Zoom has experienced. So we have this guy, he's going to go skiing. The sign says avalanche risk past this point. People have died. And he says, yeah, but not me. I'm going to be fine. Throw it in the chat. What's this bias called? If you were reading the slide before, that should give you a hint. Anyone feeling brave? What's this bias? Yeah, it's a simple one, optimism bias. And it's the idea that people tend to overestimate the probability of positive events happening to them, and we underestimate the probability of negative events happening to us in the future. So for example, we may underestimate our risk of getting cancer, of getting divorced, and overestimate the likelihood of good things happening to us, right? Our future success on the job market, the time it will take us to complete an assignment, the time it will take us to repay a loan, our relationship outcomes, right? Winning a lottery. We even overestimate our lifespan, sometimes by 20 years or more. And interestingly, we're also optimistic about not being biased, right? We think the other people on this Zoom call, they would probably succumb to choice overload, or they probably are overly optimistic, but not really me, right? This is not going to happen to me. This is why individuals don't buy insurance. We're getting there, exactly. Now, you may be thinking, but isn't it really easy to overcome optimism bias, right, in risk perception? You just give people the statistics. You just give them the facts, and people will adjust their expectations accordingly, right? Well, unfortunately, it doesn't really work out that way. So I'm gonna show you that in an interesting study. So researchers asked participants to estimate their likelihood of encountering different negative aversive events in their lifetime, like Alzheimer's disease or a burglary. So for example, let's say a person estimates that their chance of suffering from cancer in their lifetime, right? Think for a minute, if I asked you, what's your chance of suffering from cancer in your lifetime? Let's say someone said 50%. Okay, and then the researchers gave the participant, based on their health history, the actual probability, right, given their lifestyle, which let's say is 30%. Okay, they told them it's just 30%. And then they asked the person, now that you know this, what we told you, estimate again. What do you think your likelihood is of getting cancer in your your lifetime? And in light of this positive new information, what happens to the person's estimate? Yes, it goes radically down. They happy to adjust dramatically down given this optimistic expert information. But now for many participants, their initial estimates were low. So let's say this person thought their likelihood of getting cancer was just 10%. Okay, they're optimistic. But again, the actual probability of their circumstance of getting cancer is actually 30%. Again, the researchers asked the participant to reassess their chances after receiving this information, this data. And what do you think happens? Right, when they adjust their perception? Do you think they go to 29%, 50%, 20%? It's even lower, 11%. It's just a tiny slight increase, right? People tended to selectively update their beliefs because they wanted to maintain that positive outlook. So the summary, the point here, optimistic thinking is surprisingly resistant to change, even when people are faced with direct disconfirming evidence. Okay, so let's take a pause here. If you can, throw in the chat, can you think of anything that your users, that your customers might be overly optimistic about, considering their specific context? And if you can't think of something that your customers might be overly optimistic about, you can even throw in something that you think that you're probably overly optimistic about. Just so I can get some nice examples as we're chatting. Any other thoughts? Yep, income in retirement. How easy it is to complete an online undergraduate program. That's a really nice example. Yep. Housing market chain. Yeah, very relevant to today. Is thinking about the economic forecast. Chances to have a baby, really important. Great. These are all really nice, very different ideas, very different contexts of things we can be overly optimistic about. Now, I'm going to be talking about some implications of these insights later, but I'll also just mention that, if we're learning about optimism bias, we know it's really hard to change. So what are some implications for marketing, for product design, for communication design? One is just to keep in mind that your users, that your customers, that are more than excited, more than eager to see themselves in a positive light and learn positive information about themselves, right? They are happy to imagine themselves as being more successful, more well off, healthier, having a fun time, making money, right? That's just something that we're very happy to accept. And it's a bit harder for us to imagine ourselves in that negative light. Okay, so how else does optimism bias impact your customers' actions or your behavior towards risk? Well, as we saw in the chat, people often tend to under-prepare, right? People have a false sense of security. This makes us generally less likely to protect against risks. This is obviously a huge problem in the healthcare industry, in insurance industries. So let's say you're a healthcare company and you're trying to get someone vaccinated for a disease, right? And you know that it's really hard for people to think realistically about their likelihood of contracting the disease. They're optimistic they're not going to get it. What do you try to do to overcome that barrier, right? You're trying to promote vaccination, but people don't believe that they're actually going to get sick from this disease. What's a strategy? One solution, right? If you know people are optimistic, is that when you're stating the negative consequences of a behavior, you also clarify how that impact extends to other individuals, right? Yeah, you'll probably be fine if you get COVID or if you get the flu, but think about your neighbors, think about your family, right? Climate change, yeah, it's not going to affect you. You're right. It's probably going to be fine. Probably don't have to be so sustainable, but like think about the children, think about other people. You'll probably be fine. You're right, right? Lean into their optimism bias and think about how, again, you can stress how the negative impact could extend to others. Okay, right, passive smoking, secondhand smoking. So we talked about optimism bias and how difficult it can be to correct. So how do we eliminate this type of optimism bias in a situation where this is really serving as a major barrier to the action we need our customers, our users, or we need to face? So again, unfortunately, it's really hard to do. And then two things have been shown to directly reduce optimism bias. One is depression. And two is having recently and directly experienced the negative outcome associated with the risk. So let's take COVID-19 as an example. Think back a few years ago now. When did it become real for you? So maybe when someone in your town, you heard someone in your town got COVID, or was it when someone you knew directly got COVID? Right? When you're faced with that type of direct experience, that's when that optimism bias, that hopeful fuzzy feeling can start to be reduced. Now, I want to show you a real life example just to see how direct experience decreases optimism bias. And this example has to do with optimism regarding one's future job prospects after being laid off. This is obviously particularly relevant given some chatter about the current economic climate. So this figure is based on a Gallup 2013 national survey. And the researchers talked to people who were unemployed. They'd been laid off, but they'd been unemployed for less than 2 weeks, newly unemployed. And the researchers asked, do you think that in the next 4 weeks, you're going to have a job? And due to optimism bias, what they found was that about 70% of these people believe that they would have a new job within 4 weeks. Okay, so imagine it, you're 2 weeks into losing your job, you're actively searching, you're networking, you're feeling hopeful, maybe you've gotten a few bites of interviews, your friends are telling you not to worry, you're going to be okay. But does this optimism bias hold when faced with reality? What do you think this pattern looks like over time? Results show that optimism bias declines steadily as people are really experiencing unemployment. So if we look at people who have been unemployed for over 32 weeks, only 30% of those people believe that they're going to get a job in 4 weeks. And this switching happens at about 27 weeks of unemployment, where more job seekers become more pessimistic about the outcome. Why is this? Again, because when you're actually experiencing certain events, this has been shown to reduce optimism bias. You become a bit more realistic. Now, I'm going to come back to this idea of how the role of direct salient experiences can influence our risk perception shortly. Okay, so I just talked about the way that optimism bias can be overcome, but now I want to take a step back and talk about how people maintain their sense of optimism, that hopeful feeling. So one reason that we're easily able to maintain optimism is that we don't really actively seek out negative, disconfirming information. So before I go on, let me just ask you a question based on that idea. Maybe you invest in the stock market, or maybe you know someone who does. When do you think investors are most likely to check their financial portfolios? Do you think it's when the market is up, or do you think it's when the market is down? Yeah, when it's up. So you know that the S&P 500, right, we fell into a bear market in mid-June. We closed down more than 20% from the high in January. And those kinds of numbers can be very painful on the eyes and on your stomach, right? So as you expected, researchers have found that investors do tend to put their heads in the sand, right, like an ostrich, to just dodge facing their financial portfolios when they're expecting bad news. And they coined this the ostrich effect. Again, we call it information aversion. We've all experienced this, right? People sometimes avoid information, wanting to remain ignorant, and we, due to fear of bad news or of disappointment, right? It's a negative affective response and reaction when we see bad news. We don't like it. right? We tend to stick our head in the ground, and this helps us maintain that false sense of optimism about the likelihood of a negative outcome at times. Now, in addition to avoiding information about our financial health, people tend to avoid receiving bad news about their physical health. This is probably the domain where this bias is most relevant, which can lead people to avoid seeking out health information that ironically is probably critical for their health maintenance, right? Now, one study actually investigated just how much people want to remain ignorant. So this was an interesting study. Researchers went to a college and they taught a bunch of college students about the herpes virus, 2 different strains of it. And they brought along a real phlebotomist who could draw blood to test them for this virus if they wanted. And they asked these college students to make a series of real choices about how much money they'd be willing to pay to either get tested for herpes or how much they'd be willing to pay to avoid getting tested for herpes. What they found was that 5% of subjects were willing to pay $10 of their experimental earnings to not get tested for the virus. Okay, maybe that was due to needle phobia, who knows, but it's about 5%, right, was the baseline who would pay to avoid getting tested. But what's interesting here is that 15% of college students were willing to pay to avoid being tested for HSV-2, which is the more highly feared version of the virus. Okay, so suggesting that the more aversive the potential outcome, ironically, that leads to even more information avoidance. So knowing about information avoidance and optimism bias, a close cousin, right? What are some implications for product design and for communication design? So one insight is that if your product or your service might be associated with information that could be negative, when showcasing the value of your product to potential customers, you want to try to create scenarios in which your users can see themselves in positive future scenarios. So for example, Credit Karma here is showing what a customer credit profile might look like. And you see, they're not showing someone who's in financial trouble. They're showing someone with outstanding approval odds for 6 loans. So as a result of optimism bias, the prospective customer likely believes that this could be true of them too, right? So again, we're not showcasing a potential negative outcome, but potential positive feedback. So how else do we reduce the barrier of information aversion? So for example, how do we encourage people to log in to this smartphone app that can calculate a user's risk of heart disease, right? That's kind of scary. You want to make sure that any bad news or feedback is immediately associated with direct and actionable feedback on how it could be improved or made better, right? So for example, this app shows how healthy behaviors and lifestyle changes could reduce your risk of heart disease, right? So they might know negative information is coming, but you're also going to learn how to avoid that potential negative outcome. Another example, this is a really interesting product designed to overcome information aversion, and it's a product developed in collaboration with researchers at Irrational Labs. So research generally shows that if you are trying to lose weight, it's really helpful to step on the scale every morning, each day, right? Probably because you're reminding yourself that you want to be healthy in the morning, and that makes you more mindful about what you're eating during the day. But as a result of information aversion and the fear of bad news, people really don't like to do this, right? Because what if the numbers don't look so good that day? You don't really want to start your morning off with that bad feeling of disappointment. So we wondered, well, what happens when we soften the bad news and we try to reduce that information aversion? What happens if we try to build a numberless scale? And the Shape of Scale was designed to try to do this. So it incorporates a color feedback system to replace seeing your weight, that number. So instead of seeing a scary number, Shaper replaces seeing your weight with a color. And all you do is you learn if your weight has stayed the same, if it's gone down, or if it's gone up from the day before. That's it. And results from a randomized control experiment show that this Shape of Scale was more likely to lead to weight reduction compared to the standard numbered scale. So again, this works because although negative feedback might be provided, it's just not quite as aversive. Okay, so before I move on to talking about our next barrier, I want to pause. Any discussion here, any comments about how optimism bias or information aversion might be relevant to your customers, to your users, to your life, or any questions that we can discuss? Any thoughts?
I just wanted to say, Lisa, that I have a shape of scale,
Mhm.
and I'm not at my ideal weight, but but what's interesting, right, is it's an average, right? So they look at trends over time instead of the daily weight. So it's an interesting way to kind of rethink the numbers and the colors. So you can weigh in high, but still be at a good color because your average is lower. That's
Okay.
an FYI for people. It's a very interesting math trick.
Yeah. And do you feel? Oh, yeah, we got a question. Yeah, Dave, go ahead.
Just a question on that data you just showed about the Shape-A. Is that the people who use a scale with numbers gained weight? Is that something that is replicated, over and over, or is it just was it compared to the gained weight compared to the people who lost weight?
I think in this
Weight gain?
particular, yeah, that's a great question. I think in this particular experiment, they gain, but I don't know how. It's a really good question about replicating among a different sample. I would have to dig in deeper to this research to tell you, to answer that question. But that's an important point.
That's wild, and really, just a really creative approach. And I wonder about the why. I mean, Ryan, you started getting into a little bit of the why for you, but it's interesting.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite products. And I think, yeah, it's just such a nice example of you're facing this real behavioral barrier. How do you get creative about removing it? Really great solution design.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about the levers that we have available to us to help overcome optimism bias, and you mentioned, having personal experience with a recent
Mhm.
downside of a risk, and that can help ground optimism bias. But I'm also wondering about research that's been done on a peer who's had a recent negative experience, in the sharing of that experience.
Yep.
And
So go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, I'll just pause there.
So obviously personal direct experience is better than what I'd call description, right? Hearing about someone else who had that problem, but research also, or had that experience, that negative outcome. But research absolutely shows that the closer you are to that peer who's sharing that personal experience, the more likely optimism bias is to be reduced. So that's absolutely true. And often that's a strategy that we have to leverage, because you can't, right? If you're trying to overcome optimism bias, you can't just make someone experience that negative outcome, right? That's obviously that's not applicable. And so testimonials or stories about someone else facing that outcome is usually the strategy that we employ. But again, just like anything having to do with social norms and peer comparison, the closer someone feels to that other, right, the stronger the impact that other's story is going to have in impacting our own perceptions and how we update our beliefs. A really good point. That's sort of our strategy in terms of helping people to experience that negative outcome. Great question. Okay. So we talked about optimism bias, we talked about information aversion and fear of negative information. And now I want to turn to talking about one of the most important biases or cognitive heuristics associated with risk perception, and that is availability bias. And this is very relevant to sort of that system one, the impact of relying on system one and taking those mental shortcuts to guiding our risk perception. Okay, so let's take a guessing game. Nobody cheat, nobody Google this. what do you think is a more likely cause of death? A, being killed by a shark, or B, being killed by a champagne cork? Throw it in the chat if you're willing. Cork, 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 cork. Okay, you guys, you're right. What do you think the average person who's not part of this Zoom call on risk perception might think? Yeah, there we go. Should have framed it that way.
Yeah, you should have started with representational bias, you know.
That's right. You guys are a bit biased. Yes. So most people, if we ask them this question, well, so yes, you are right. You are actually 3 times more likely to die by a champagne cork. 24 people die annually from a champagne cork. About 6 to 8 people are killed annually every year by a shark. But most people would think the opposite. And now here's the important question. Why do most people think shark deaths are more common? Let me see some reasons in the chat. Brett, that's an interesting point. So that was pretty salient that was just in the news. I didn't know that. Because we hear more about it. Jaws. There are movies about sharks. Movies. They instill more fear. There's something about sharks that are scary looking, right? They're frightening to imagine precisely. I can recall more shark-related deaths. I saw a movie about a shark-related death. I read online about a terrible shark attack, right? I can't recall any instances of a person being killed by a cork, although apparently we can, right? And I can easily imagine going swimming and getting attacked by a frightening shark, right? That's something that's vivid, that's kind of familiar to me. That's something that I can easily imagine. I've never thought before about being killed by a cork, a champagne cork, right? Because what comes to mind more easily, more readily, that's more vivid, a shark death, is what people tend to think is more likely to occur and what people would therefore tend to worry more about. And this is a cognitive heuristic. It's very related to our system one fast thinking, as I mentioned earlier, right? The availability heuristic is a bias in which a person relies on easily recalled information when they're making a decision. And also as a consequence, we ignore less easily recalled information. If I can think of it, it must be important. So in a nutshell, our brain is taking this kind of lazy route to making a quick judgment. And if it can access a very vivid recent memory in relation to the decision, it goes along with it, right? So to go a step further, we judge how likely something is to happen or a risk is to occur based on how available, how top of mind it is for us. And it turns out that availability, how available something is in our mind, how easily it comes to mind, is determined by 4 different factors. So things that occur more frequently are more available, right? That makes a lot of sense, right? Things that occur more frequently probably are more likely to occur. So that's a factor that is quite logical, right? If I see a lot of shark deaths on TV, if I read about it in the news, it's probably occurring quite often. But things that occur more recently are also more available. And things that we're more generally familiar with are more available. And things that are more tangible, more emotionally salient are more available. So salient risks, like a shark attack, are more easy to imagine. They come to mind more quickly. They're more available in our minds. This makes us think that these events occur more frequently than they actually do. And this makes people worry about them too much. In contrast, when a risk feels very abstract, psychologically abstract, we worry a lot less about it. So certain concepts are psychologically abstract, and certain events feel more abstract. Events that occur far away in space or in time, like the future, are psychologically abstract. And events that that are happening to strangers, faraway strangers, are psychologically abstract. We worry less about that, like climate change. So let me give you a few examples of how these factors impact availability and lead to some misperceptions about risk. I think we have a question, Dave. Oh, old question. Okay. So I just brought up climate change. I'm going to stick with this domain for a minute. So we know heat waves and unusually warm temperatures are very front of mind. They're very available and salient to us right now, right? We all probably experienced that heat wave. I did last week here in Boston. And anecdotally, it feels like more people are talking about climate change and worrying about climate change during this heat wave on these warm days, right? And a team of researchers I worked with at Columbia and we were really curious about this. And we wanted to ask this question: do people actually care more about climate change on a day that happens to be warmer than usual compared to a day that's colder than usual? And what might be the implications of that? So we ran a research study, and we asked a big group of participants across the political spectrum, does today feel colder or warmer than usual for this time of year? That's it. And then we asked them about how much they worry about climate change, how much they believe in climate change. And by the way, we asked them, would you be willing to donate some of your experimental earnings from this research study to a climate change charity? And what we found was that people who thought today was warmer than usual for this time of year believed more in climate change, they worried more about climate change, and they donated more money to a climate change charity compared to people who thought today was colder than usual. We term this the local warming effect. Why? Because today's temperature is recent, today's temperature is salient. And this affects availability, shifting people's perception of how likely other warm or cold days are throughout the past year, shifting people's risk perception. Okay, so as a result of these factors that influence availability, recency, and salience, we find that these factors also influence what we choose to protect ourselves against. So we tend to insure against risks that are salient, concrete, emotionally salient, and risks that either occurred really recently or are occurring now, right? Not risks that are going to be occurring far in the future, right? We tend to underinsure against risks, as I said, that feel psychologically abstract or uncertain and occur far off in the distance in space and time. And there's been some really interesting research exploring this phenomenon. So for example, it turns out that people are more willing to buy insurance for death due to an accident. They're more likely to buy insurance, life insurance and pay for a payout due to an accident, right, than death due to natural causes, since death by accident is a much more salient and concrete way to die. And similarly, people are willing to pay more money for flight insurance coverage that protects them if they die due to an act of terrorism versus dying from a mechanical failure on the flight. Again, just emphasizing the idea that we tend to overprotect against more salient emotional risks. We worry a lot more about them, and we really want to protect ourselves against those types of risks. But again, we're also much more likely to protect against risks that have recently occurred. So for example, one of the most predictable after effects of a hurricane or an earthquake is a spike in insurance demand. So people have a tendency to estimate the likelihood and the consequences of future disasters by focusing on recent past experiences, which come to mind quickly. Now, this is sometimes referred to as the hurricane effect, but it could also be called the heart attack effect or the flood effect or the car accident effect, right? When an unexpected accident or natural disaster strikes, like the flooding happening right now today in Kentucky, it is suddenly much more salient and concrete, right? This bad thing could also happen to me, right? Again, especially if you live close by to Kentucky, and this feels more real, more relevant. So given this knowledge, let's apply it. Let's say you're a company and you're selling people unemployment insurance up to $9,000 if you unexpectedly or suddenly lost your job. And this is a real task that we were faced with at Irrational Labs. How do we encourage people to purchase this type of unemployment insurance? And we thought, well, how do we make this risk of losing one's job more available for people? How do we make it feel more salient, more familiar? What could we do? And the only thing we could really work with was this landing page screen. How do we make that risk of unemployment more salient? But we also have to consider optimism bias, right? We don't want to scare people. What we did is we simply tried to provide some really concrete examples of what someone might lose and need money for if they did lose their job, right? So what are you going to do about rent, right? If you just lost your job, daycare, doctor bills, and just this really simple modification to the landing page, right? That's really focusing on familiarity and salience to boost availability, we found led to significant page over page conversion. Okay, so I've now talked about two key characteristics that can influence people's perceptions of risk and whether we take action to protect against these risks, whether they occur now or whether they occur in the future, and whether they feel concrete or if they feel abstract or uncertain. But it turns out that risk perception is influenced by a number of psychological factors. And these factors tend to sort themselves along two different dimensions: the degree to which a risk is dreaded and the degree to which a risk is unknown. So dread risks are uncontrollable, they're catastrophic, they're involuntary, they're fatal, they're global, and they're not easily reduced. And something's more of an unknown risk if it's not understood by science, if it's unobservable, if it's new, and if it's delayed, right? So those factors that are bolded on this screen, we tend to inflate risks when, right, when something is technical, when something's involuntary, fast progressing. Now, dread risks are uncontrollable and they're new. And so if we think about sort of a dread risk, what might come to mind? We think of things like a handgun, right? Like something that is really going to inspire that feeling of dread. And what's really interesting is that researchers have actually mapped where a number of risky activities fall along these two different factors, these two different risk dimensions. So the horizontal axis here represents the degree to which a risk is dreaded, with higher ratings on the right. And the vertical axis represents the degree to which a risk is unknown, with higher ratings at the top, right? So again, example, handguns are pretty high in the dread scale, but low on unknown, versus climate change tends to be pretty high on the unknown scale, but it's actually pretty low on the dreaded scale. By the way, what do you think we tend to protect ourselves against more? What sort of factors do you think scare us the most, whether something is dreaded or whether something is unknown? Yes, dreaded. So the more a person dreads an activity, the higher its perceived risk perception, right? And the more that person wants this risk reduced. Again, these dreaded risks tend to be much more salient, familiar to us than unknown risks. And we can actually map a lot of different types of risks on this scale, right? To get a sense of what type of risk people are going to worry about. And a lot of psychologists who study risk perception and psychometrics have mapped a number of different types of risks on along these two factors to just get a sense of people's risk perception and attitudes towards a number of different risks. So when you're thinking about your customers or your business challenge or your own life and the degree to which you worry about a risk, it can be helpful to just take a step back and think about what are the characteristics of this risk, right? That's someone that I'm considering, and where you might expect it to fall on this scale. Is this something you think people are going to be worrying about? Is this something that people are going to be trying to overprotect themselves against? Or underprotect themselves against. So there's a number of risks that psychologists haven't tested. Okay, I see, Ryan, I just got your message. We are at the 10-minute mark, but that's good because I wanted to leave 10 minutes for comments and feedback at the end. So let's turn to that.
Such timing, such timing. Yeah. It's like you're a trained professional at this. Okay. Yeah, so what questions do people have? We would love to hear from you. You can raise your hand, or obviously you can use the chat. Dave, you said that was an old hand raise. Oh, but Brett, you're a new hand raise. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, I'm struggling a little bit with the unknown versus dreaded, because it seems a bit subjective. I mean, if maybe if we take something like agoraphobia or versus versus spiders, we have one person who's agoraphobic and we have one person who's really afraid of spiders. And there's, if I think about it like in a Venn diagram, the person who's agoraphobic, one of the reasons they may be agoraphobic is that they're afraid of, they think that if they go on a picnic outside, they could be bit by a spider. But it's more general and unknown. But if you surveyed them, they probably say, well, yeah, that's a possibility.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm having
really good point. So individual differences matter. And if you ask very different groups of people about some questions regarding risk, which a lot of researchers have done, you'll see that this is an average across a huge group of participants, but there are huge individual differences, especially for a risk like climate change, vaccinations, handguns, right? So this is aggregate results, but if you zoom in on one population, you're going to see really different results. And so that's a really nice point, which is when you're thinking about a specific risk, you want to think not only, right, where you think the average person is going to place this on the unknown versus dread scale, but is there a subgroup that's really dreading this versus a subgroup that is really, right, that is there a group that might be inflating this risk versus a group that's really ready to under prepare for it because they're not worrying? And is the strategy going to be different for those two groups of people, right? So people who are spider phobic, obviously for that group, right, that is high dread, versus maybe for the average individual, right, it's low on the dread scale. So yes, individual differences matter. And your specific audience matters. And when you're thinking about where a risk might lie, you really want to be thinking about your target audience, absolutely, or different groups, because that's an excellent point, especially when we think about the political spectrum, past experience, all of that influences risk perception. Again, this is just an aggregate average of the US population. Yep.
Lisa, my favorite thing in there is railroads. So I'm really wondering about who the big railroadophobic community is. So if you could get that more granular data for me, ASAP, I'd appreciate it.
Yes, and of course, when we're talking risk, we're talking an accident, right, associated with a train, like a train accident, getting hit by a train. So that's apparent. Yeah, that's something that people are dreading versus, surprisingly, right, a bike, where we know people can really get hurt, right, is really low on the dread scale, right? Because these are misperceptions. People are not, these are based on that system one thinking, our emotions, our gut availability. It's not accurate, but this is just, again, just how, when this study was done in 2016, the average person was placing these specific risks on these two subscales.
So with that, let's go to Brett. Thank you for that question. We have two more and we have about time for two more. So Shay, you are up, and then Dan, you're on deck.
Awesome. Thank you for that great lecture, Lisa. Definitely learned a lot. I was super interested in the scalar research, particularly around information aversion. I was curious if you have seen or found that any of the findings that you found in Scala are more applied universally, like such as like kind of like color being a means to overcoming inversion or showing deviations from the mean as opposed to like absolute numbers, things like that?
That's a great question. I don't think I know of any other product that knew it was providing negative feedback and tried to soften that feedback in that way, using a different scale, like that sort of visual scale versus numerical scale. What comes to mind is a lot of research has been done on how you might communicate, how a utility company might communicate to a utility customer that they're using too much energy, right? Especially compared to your neighbor, right? You're not doing well. You're using too much energy. There's a lot of research from OPower that explores how we communicate that. What they found is if you give people negative feedback, right? You just directly tell them, like, you're spending way too much money on energy, right? Your neighbors are spending a lot less than you. You might want to work on how you reduce your energy loads. That there's a lot of negative reaction to that people don't like hearing that they're doing worse. And so there's been a lot of research on how you soften that negative feedback, right? Maybe you only give positive feedback to people who are doing well compared to their neighbors, and you don't provide that kind of negative feedback to someone who's not doing well, right? And we try to soften it with our framing and with our communication, because it's just, we generally know when you're communicating with someone and you're giving them negative feedback, you want to be really careful, right? That's not loss. That's not leaning into loss aversion. It's really different when you're providing someone negative feedback and you're trying to get them to change their behavior. You have to be really careful with that. But again, I think Shape is the only product. I'm sure there are others out there. I don't know, Ryan, if you're familiar with any that are trying to soften the negative feedback using a different type of quantitative scale.
Yeah, I don't have any off the top of my dome, but I'll probably think of something tomorrow afternoon at like 1:45.
I'm gonna ponder that one. Yeah.
How this always works. Cool. And Dan, our final, obviously saving the best for last, Dan Coleman, bring your huge wrap-up question to the game.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks as always. This actually, I have a big question, but it's really ill-shaped, and so I apologize ahead. But as you're talking, Lisa, that's really fascinating stuff. I'm wondering, have you ever thought about or encountered ways these questions of risk apply to the world or the field of learning? Because obviously, like, there are all sorts of ways in which we take risks. For example, to ask a question in front of a group, right? And risk looking really dumb, or even when you're not in front of a group, but you're just going to learn something new, and maybe you'll suck at it. Have you thought, or have you seen folks kind of use the levers that you're describing here, or the understandings to?
It's a great point. There hasn't been much research that's directly tried to link this terminology associated with risks with sort of that fear of sort of a negative response from a peer or a sort of social engagement by participating, for example, in class. Instead, but there is a lot of research that has looked at that. And I'm thinking, Ryan, specifically about the psychology of connection and trust. I know we've talked a lot about that at Irrational Labs, which shows that people actually tend to think that their comments, their feedback is going to be not received positively, and they tend to really over worry about that. And that tends to lead us to fail to build connections, to actively approach and engage with strangers and with others. So it can be negative. So it's absolutely something that some people dread, and that it's a risk that people tend to inflate. But I'm not familiar with research that's directly linking that context to these type of risks that I've been mentioning. And I think they really should, because that's a really, what are your thoughts in terms of?
Well, I saw Dave's comment about the shape of scale and how, obviously, a scale gives you feedback, but as teachers, we give feedback like crazy.
Yes.
And I'm sure we don't think nearly enough about, its impact on the people we're feedbacking. I think the way you go toward thinking about connection and trust is beautiful, frankly. Like it's the same question, it's just in a different space. Like how do you build a space, whether it's a classroom or an online community, where people
Yeah.
feel more comfortable, more safe.
Oh,
You know,
I love that application. That's really fascinating. I haven't made that connection before. I'm thinking personally when I'm grading, right? Sometimes we get really granular, right? A, B plus. And I know that students dread turning over their paper to see how they did, right? Versus some classes, right? It will just be a check plus, right? We just want to say you're doing better, right? You're not meeting your expectations, right? But we don't want to scare you with that real negative feedback. It's a really interesting question. Again, I don't think it's been studied before.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I think the things are studied, but to Lisa's original point, the vocabulary is completely
Yeah,
different.
not associated with.
So the whole standards-based grading movement, right, to eliminate grade-based assessments and move toward meet, succeeds, achieve, or beginning, emerging, excelling, innovating, all these kind of spectrums of assessment are ways to soften and focus more on process rather than outcome. But certainly the people working in that field, in the assessment literacy field, are not looking in the risk management field, right? So they're not speaking the same language, but they are working toward the same outcome. And even things like imposter syndrome. I mean, this is an adjacent field of study. I guess it's interesting though, Lisa, because going back to the graph, these risks listed here are infinitely more concrete. I mean, climate change is more concrete than public speaking in this study, right, that you were citing. So I think there's a parallel world there, but drawing those bridges, yeah, like, so none of those that we see on the graph are social things. And of course, we all know, like, public speaking is, terrifies most people. So anyways, Lisa, any closing thoughts? Only because I have to jump over to another event, so I have to wrap us up tightly.
No, I would just say, for members, I'm happy if you have any other questions, or if you have a really specific question, I can try to point you towards an academic paper that might address it. I want to just double check the literature on education and see if that has, maybe someone has done a study associating it with this scale and this risk perception. We're going to check it out. But yeah, feel free to email me if there's anything else, if you have any other comments or anything else you want to share, happy to chat.
Yeah, so thank you everybody for coming. We had almost 50 people today, which is super exciting. We have a very, very dynamic schedule for August. I'm just waiting you've gotten some of the invites. There are open invite you have not received yet. So we have a great slate of people. Some times are being locked for the open event, so stay tuned. Hopefully next week I'll be able to give you the whole slate. Special thank you to Lisa and all your genius and your brilliance. Our emails tend to be easy to remember. Lisa@irrationallabs.com. I'm Ryan@irrationallabs.com. There's no funky numbers after our names. So please do reach out. We're here to help, engage, enlighten, and learn from you. So please, please, please don't be strangers. And unfortunately, I've got to close this one up fast. So everybody can give Lisa a big thanks in the chat. And we'll see you all next week, I believe. Carl Purcell, games and learning and behavior change. Very exciting stuff.
Thanks,
Thank you
everybody.
again, Lisa. All right, take care, everybody.